Again, it saves the American taxpayers billions of dollars not having to pay pharma for these things. You know, we're growing back black wealth. Well, we have a lot more to do. The racial wealth gap is the smallest it's been in 20 years under my watch.
We're not doing that. You all know how I feel about that racial wealth gap. You all know how I feel about that racial wealth gap. I'm going to run that fraudulent claim one more time, because technically on paper it's true. In reality, no. No.
Smallest it's been. You know, we're growing back black wealth. Well, we have a lot more to do. The racial wealth gap is the smallest it's been in 20 years under my watch.
Knock it off. Knock it off. This portion is going to be a little bit lengthy, because I'm going to go through an article right here. I tried to shorten it up to the best that I could, but this article truly breaks down how fraudulent that claim is. And I'll also go on and say this. He's saying that the racial wealth gap is the smallest that it's been in 20 years. As far as I've seen, I wasn't able to find any type of data substantiating that claim. Maybe it does exist out there. I'm not saying that it does, but I didn't see any data that substantiates that. That is the slowest that it's been in 20 years, as far as him specifically stating that 20-year period. But technically speaking, he wasn't lying when he said the racial wealth gap shrunk. But by how much? To what degree? Was it significant? Is it the type of shrinkage that we can expect to see moving forward? By the end of within the next 4 years, will the racial wealth gap be completely done with? Let's find out. Let's find out. At the current pace that the racial wealth gap is allegedly, technically shrinking, at this pace, how long will it take for the racial wealth gap to actually close with all this hard work that Joe Biden is doing for us? Let's get into that right now. Let's get into it. So here I want to pull up this article. Here we go. And give me just a second while I actually pull it up. And this right here is an article from Forbes. And it reads, racial wealth inequality gradually declines, but that is no reason to celebrate. Now, if you type into Google, right? If you type, I hate that. I got that. There we go. Now, if you type into Google right now, right? If you type into Google, is the racial wealth gap shrinking? You will see and find a host of articles stating that it is, that was written in this same time period in January of 2023, but all the titles read exactly the same, where technically it was shrinking, but realistically nothing is happening. And I want to get into that right now. So like I said, this portion is going to be a little bit lengthy, but let's get into it, because it's worth unpacking something that fraudulent as far as I'm concerned. So the article reads as such: wealth inequality by race remains staggeringly high, but it has gradually declined. But this difference is also no cause for celebration. Wealth inequality remains high, and most Black and Latino households did not see any wealth gains, while most white households did. Go figure. While the racial wealth gap is technically shrinking, Black Americans didn't see a wealth gain, but your white counterparts did. But the racial wealth gap is shrinking. Go figure. Go figure, right? Let's carry on. Let's carry on. The current wealth gap by race and ethnicity are in fact larger than they were in the 1990s. The difference in average wealth by race or ethnicity has recently declined, technically. At the start of the illness in March of 2020, white households owned almost 5 times as much wealth as Latino households, for example. As housing and stock markets boomed, the gap shrank. So the white households owned only 4 times as much as Latino households did in September of 2022. A shrinking wealth gap is more desirable than a widening wealth gap, assuming people of color's wealth is growing faster rather than declining more slowly than the white household. But there is a lot more to this story than that. Here's where it gets really good and extremely informative. Most importantly, the wealth gap is still massive, and it will take targeted large wealth transfers such as reparations for Black households to ultimately eliminate it. And for those of you who are wondering, yes, this article was written by a white American. I know for some people that matters. So yeah, it wasn't a Black guy that wrote this, it wasn't a, woke, Black guy that did this. No. It was a white guy that said reparations is the key. Not me. The current wealth gap is larger than it was in the 1990s, even after shrinking for 2 years. I want to repeat that one more time. The current wealth gap is larger than it was in the 1990s, even after shrinking for 2 years. It would also take 100 years to eliminate the gap without such policy steps, assuming that the wealth continues to shrink at the pace of the past 2.5 years. A small dent in a widespread racial wealth gap differences does not constitute racial equality. I want to stay right here for a moment. At the current pace of this so-called racial wealth gap shrinkage, studies show it will take 100 years. 100 years for the racial wealth gap to actually close, or at least to be reasonable at best. 100 years. Does that sound like a victory? Does that sound like the racial wealth gap is actually shrinking? Because that shrinkage, as you've seen so far, based off what I read, and as you will see as I continue to read, is mainly based off markets. The housing market and the stock market, which goes up and down, just like unemployment rates go up and down, up and down. So common sense tells you it's not going to stay like that. It's not going to stay like that. It's temporary. The markets went up for housing in the stock market, and it will go back down. So once again, this is all foolishness that you hear coming from Joe Biden. Now, I could end that portion here, but I'm not going to, because to me, this particular portion is extremely important, of the stream is extremely important. And we have to understand this, because that is such a bold claim to say that under Biden's watch, he has shrunk the racial wealth gap to the lowest that it's been in 20 years. That is such, realistically speaking, a fraudulent claim that can't just be something that's glossed over quickly. So let's get back into this article. There are 414 of you in the live stream right now. Please hit the like button if you haven't already. Please smash that like button as we continue on. We do know, however, that the recent disproportionate gains for Black and Latino households resulted from outsized increases in real estate wealth. Average home equity for Black households grew by 75% for Blacks and by 85% for Latino households, but only 22.1% for white households from March 2020 to September of 2022. Yet, most Black and Latino households do not own a house. Most of us don't even own a house. So these gains have nothing to do with the majority of the population. Their ownership rates were 45.2% and 48.7%, respectively, in September of 2022. A long history of housing and mortgage market discrimination has kept and still keeps Black and Latino households out of home ownership. As a result, the median home equity for Black and Latino households is zero. I'm going to read that again. As a result, the median home equity for Black and Latino households is zero. And most Black and Latino households saw no gains from the run up of housing prices. You saw nothing. It benefited you not one bit. In contrast, 3 and 4 white households were homeowners in September of 2022, meaning that most white households indeed benefited from the rapid rise in house prices. These differences in home ownership rates also make it much less likely that the wealth gap at the median is also shrinking alongside the average wealth gap. Further, Black and Latino households own much less financial wealth than is the case for white households. This then also means that the gain in real estate wealth made up the bulk of the overall wealth gains for Black and Latino households, 76% and 85%, respectively. Again, the article reiterates, again, in case Vote Blue No Matter Who's want to get happy and think that there was some great victory. Again, most Black and Latino households saw none of those gains, but those gains are almost the entire story of the past 2.5 years. And most of the financial gains from the stock market ran up, but only a minority of Black and Latino households own stocks, either outright or through their retirement accounts. Calculations based on the Federal Reserve data show that 34% of Black households and 24% of Latino households owned any stocks, while 61% of white households did. The overwhelming majority of Black and Latino households, I'm going to repeat that again, the overwhelming majority of Black and Latino households, hence, did not see any gains from the stock market gains over the past few years, while most white households did. We're about to wrap it up right now. These data suggest that the median racial wealth gap possibly did not shrink as much as the average wealth gap. The wealth gains that contributed to, the wealth gains that contributed to a declining average racial wealth gap were concentrated among a minority of Black and Latino households, while they were more evenly distributed amongst white households. I want to read that middle portion one last time. The wealth gains that contributed to a declining average racial wealth gap were concentrated among a minority of Black and Latino households, while they were more evenly distributed among white households. The bottom line is that the racial wealth gap is still and has remained stubbornly large and will stay that way unless policymakers at the federal, state, and local level step up. And step up with what? Step up with policy that is specifically targeted towards the Black community. But we all know that that's not going to happen, right? They're not going to do that, because what the Democratic Party engages in is, once again, victories with no victory. A victory that you can talk about, but a victory that you can't show me. A so-called victory and the so-called shrinkage of the racial wealth gap, to which, technically speaking, the racial wealth gap is shrinking, yet white Americans are still receiving the majority of the gain. I don't know. But yeah, this November, what do I know? I'm just spreading fake news. Vote blue no matter who. Biden Harris 2024. And then after that, Michelle Obama Harris 2028. Right? Now let's get back into what Joe Biden had to say when he was at the church